Hello and welcome to this first task in our course. Now, on this specific occasion, on this first occasion, we're going to be talking or we're going to be exploring the topic of literacy. Now, literacy is quite an important point here, specifically in this course, since we're going to be eventually talking and exploring and doing practices on teaching reading and writing. So, literacy is a really important starting point for this. Now, eventually, we do want to get into second language literacy, but it is also relevant to talk about first language literacy. So, initially in this task, you will be exploring just the topic, getting your own definition of what literacy is. Literacy in the general sense, because you can be literate in specific areas, but our interest here is literacy in a very general sense. And then once we have that, we want to get into comparing and contrasting. Well, what are exactly are the conditions that a young child goes through in order to become literate in his or her first language? Now, this is quite important. So here you have a lot of experience actually. Remember, there was a time when you did not know how to read and write, and then you went to school and you learned to read and write, and thus you became literate. Well, this is a certain context, and you have a support system where initially it's your family, your friends, your teacher, and then the environment that takes place in. And also how first language is not just something that you're going to school to learn, but it's everywhere around you. So there's a very specific context under which you become literate in your first language. Now, as you migrate and you become older and you migrate into a second language, conditions change completely, and you begin to learn a second language and thus try to become literate in that second language. In other words, you try to learn to read and write. But the conditions under which this happens are completely different. Thus, for our understanding, you're very likely a teenager or an adult. You already are an expert in your first language, in that you communicate successfully in all scenarios. But now, as a second language, there's quite a very different context from which the scenario where you were becoming literate in your first language. So it's comparing and contrasting those two things. What happened in first language and what can potentially happen in second language? What are the benefits and difficulties in first language? What are the benefits and difficulties in second language? And once we start understanding the relationship that happens here, it starts to become more clear as teachers what we need to do in order to be successful teachers of reading and writing in a second language. And this can be any language. This can be English, this can be French, Japanese. The foundational elements, theoretical, methodological, foundational elements are pretty much the same across the board with languages. So we can start with English, but eventually, if you're trying to become an expert in another language, whatever we practice here is going to work just fine. Okay, that's a little bit of introduction to our first task. Below, you'll have all of the instructions and all of the details. Do pay attention to how you need to deliver your documents, your evidence of learning, and also take note on the evaluation list found towards the bottom of this page, where you'll see the list of elements that you need to complete in your delivery, and also the percentages of scores and how everything adds up. Okay, with that being said, let's get started with task